Each man must do his bit.
Welcome to another edition of The Public Interest. My name is David Granger, and on this series of programs, we examine issues of public interest to Guyanese at home and in the diaspora. Most particularly, I think Guyanese are worried, deeply concerned about the level of violence in society. And we must understand the roots of violence if we are to eradicate violence. When we speak of domestic violence, gang violence, school violence, we must understand where this violence came from. Many of us were deeply disturbed in 2020 when a PPP gang, PPP riot in West Babis, Region 5, stoned a school bus at, in the middle of the day, 12 o'clock in the day on the public road. Who could be traveling in a school bus but school children on a school day? And several poor school children were injured. But when you get to that level of violence, my friends, we need to examine the roots of the violence, and we need to eradicate violence. And this is what this program is about today. And regrettably, I've got to go back a little bit in history, but don't be afraid. We will move forward to show that violence is not a permanent condition of Guyana and that we could eradicate violence. If you look back to the situation that existed after the Second World War, you see that all over the British Empire, poverty, political exclusion, economic underdevelopment, social marginalization were creating problems. And many veterans coming back from the World War, many people who left their countries to go and fight for Britain and saw how Britain was developed. And they thought they were going to get a bonanza after the war, but they came back to see the same old conditions. And many of them contribute to the demand for freedom. Many young people went away to study, and they came back and demanded, that their own colonies, their own countries became free. And people wanted a good life. And you couldn't get a good life under the British Empire. The British Empire was weak. And in fact, during just prior to the World War, the situation was so bad that the British government had to establish something called a Royal Commission under Lord Moyne. And the report was so rotten that the British government refused to publish it because they felt that the German Nazi government would use it as propaganda. In any event, after the war, they started to make some changes on the economic and the political front, even on the education front, because that is when the University of the West Indies came to be established. So they knew something was badly wrong. And in Guyana, we knew something was wrong, and we wanted to make a change. As a result of that, a new constitution was introduced based on universal adult franchise. Unbelievably, for many young people, before 1953, many adults could not vote. You had to have a literacy qualification, you had to have a property qualification. So it meant that a large part of the electorate, well, it wasn't electorate, a large part of the population, adult population, including women, of course, could not vote. So it was not until 1953, April, that Guyana was able to have a constitution in which what we now recognize as general elections occurred. And the original People's Progressive Party, and I have to use the word original because the original People's Progressive Party had as its chairman Forbes Burnham, who was the head of the party. And in fact, Chetty Jagan was not the leader of the party. At first, there was no leader. Chetty Jagan was one of the vice presidents, a vice chairman of the party. And this is something that must be understood, that the head of the PPP in 1950, 74 years ago, was Forbes Burnham. And it was a multi-ethnic party. There were a large number of Chinese, Africans, Indians, in the party at that time. And when elections were held in April 1953, the original PPP won 51% of the vote. 51%. It wasn't a landslide. What was a landslide was the number of seats they got. They got 75% of the seats with 51% of the vote. And it meant they were able to dominate they had over two-thirds majority in the Legislative Council, as it was called then. It was not called the National Assembly, it was called the Legislative Council. The abbreviation was LegCo. And some of the PPP became ministers, PPP members became ministers in what became the EXCO, that is the Executive Council. It wasn't called a cabinet. There was no prime minister. The governor was in charge. The governor was very much in charge. So the Executive Council was made up of persons he nominated as well as persons who were elected. And bear this in mind, my friends, 5 of the 6 PPP ministers were trade union officials. Paul Burnham was in the British Ghana Labor Union, Cherry Jagan was in the Sawmill and Forest Workers Union, Ashton Chase was in the BGLU. In fact, Joseph Lachman Singh, who was the first chairman of the PNC, was the founder of the GIW, the Guyana Industrial Workers Union. So you can see, in addition to Ashton Chase, who was, and all of the other ministers, you can see that the so-called Executive Council on the elected side was dominated by persons who had trade union affiliations. And this will have a very strong influence on the way the PPP administration behaved. Now, many people do not realize that among the reasons for the suspension of the Constitution in October 1953 was because the Guyana Industrial Workers Union, with PPP support, called a strike in August 1953. And the Legislative Council, dominated by the PPP, passed a labor relations bill on the 8th of October. And the governor proclaimed a state of emergency on the 9th of October. So the real reason for the proclamation has to be linked with the GIW strike, mostly in the sugar industry. So the Constitution was suspended on the 9th of October. The PPP elected ministers were expelled from the government. The British Army was called. So you can link the trade union activity of GIW to the suspension of the Constitution in 1953. This is something that the PPP and other persons do not try to explain to the public. And this is what we're doing on the public interest, explaining what happened so you can see how violence came about. Now, this crisis, this constitutional crisis, was clearly the result of the PPP's attempt to control the country through the Legislative Council, because they already had over two-thirds majority there, and through its control of the trade unions. As I said, that at first, 5 of the 6 elected PPP ministers were union officials. So they intended to use the unions to bring about their political objectives. And it is clear in my mind that the 1953 strike by the GIW was a contributory factor to the suspension of the Constitution. And don't forget that union was not only founded by J.P. Lachman Singh, but the General Secretary was Jane Phillips Gay, who became the first chairperson of the People's National Congress Women's Organization, Women's Association. So you can see how history throws light on these obscure areas of political development. My friends, after the suspension of the Constitution, in 1953. There was a period of marking time in which the British government appointed ministers who were not elected. All of them were nominated by the government. And of course, there were some people who did not have any grassroots political affiliation. These were just nominees or appointees. And at the same time, from 1954, the PPP started to embark on what they called a campaign of passive resistance. Well, it wasn't so passive. Many of them were arrested for different acts, sometimes simply violation of the emergency regulations. But that was the time in May 1954 when the statue of Queen Victoria was blown up. It was blown up by the PPP terrorists. And many people in Georgetown contributed to repairing the damage to the statue. And of course, as you know the story, when the PNC got into office, the Prime Minister Burnham removed the statue and put it at the back of the botanical gardens. And when the PPP got into office in 1952, they moved the statue back. So if you look at the statue now, it's damaged. But originally, the damage was caused by PPP terrorists. But that's just another matter that we can deal with some other time. Now, after the Constitution was changed in 1957, it was changed again in 1961. This time to allow for a more representative form of government after the interim administration. Nobody wanted interim administration. Nobody was elected, and it wasn't responsive to the needs of the ordinary people. So when the new constitution was established or introduced, the PPP this time separated from the faction which became the PNC. The PPP in 1957 won 46.7% of the vote, but it was allocated 65% of the seats in the Legislative Council. 46% of the votes gained them 65% of the seats. The PNC won 39% of the vote and got 28% of the seats in the Legislative Council. This was because the electoral system was unbalanced. Let me try to give you a simple example as briefly as possible. If you have one constituency, if there's one constituency, and there are 5 parties competing for 100 votes in that constituency, if 4 parties each get 18 votes, that would be 72%. But if the 5th party got 28 votes, that would give that 5th party the whole constituency. It would mean that the votes of the other 72% would be of no effect, because the one party that only won 28%, not a majority, the one party that only won 28% would claim the whole constituency. So it is clear that the system under which that situation could arise was unfair, unbalanced. That is what is called first past the post system. I compare it to Usain Bolt. There's only one winner, and whoever passes the post first is declared the winner. Whereas the proportional representation system means that every party will be entitled to the allocation of seats in proportion to the number of votes it got. So if a party got 57% of the vote, it will get 57% of the seats. So the system under which the first past the post elected person to the Legislative Council was unbalanced. And the PNC and later on the United Force started to agitate to have a more balanced system or a fairer system so that if the party won 12% of the vote, it will get 12% of the seats. Now we'll come to what that involved because people died to have that system introduced. Now we see what happened in the 1957 elections. Again, the constitution was improved, and in 1961, Guyana got an advanced constitution, which was described as internal self-government. It was not independent, but it meant that elected ministers could govern their ministries or their portfolios without direction of the governor. But in 1961, we had the same unbalanced first past the post system. In these elections, the PPP won 42.6%, which is, of course, a reduction from what it won in 1957. 42.6% of the vote. But under the unbalanced system, it was able to get 57% of the votes in the Legislative Assembly, as the National Assembly was then called. It changed from LegCo to Legislative Assembly. The PNC won 41% of the vote and got 31% of the seats. And the United Force, which was formed only the year before, was able to win 16% of the vote, which it was the most successful third party in Guyana. But it got 12% of the seats. In summary, my friends, what I am putting to you is that the combined opposition in the elections of August 1961 was able to win 57.3% of the vote, but it only gained 43% of the seats. On the other hand, the People's Progressive Party was able to form the government by winning 42.6% of the vote, and it got 57% of the seats. Well, even a blind man could see that is unfair, unbalanced, and unacceptable. So I would say that from 1961, it became clear to everyone that the first past the post system was unworkable for Guyana's particular reality, social and political reality. This led to confrontation. And the PPP, when it got into government in 1961, within 6 months, in February 1962, introduced a budget. This budget is called the Caldor budget. This is because an economist from Britain called Nicholas Caldor drafted the budget. I don't think he understood Guyana society very well. But this was a time when, many urban workers, particularly public servants, teachers, nurses, policemen, and so on, were under severe pressure economically. And the PPP put one of its ministers to confront the public servants. Although it was not his portfolio, it was the deputy premier at the time. And he told the public servant not a cent more. Well, the unions were quite irritated by that minister's behavior. And he became notorious for other statements, like it's easier to stop communism than to stop. It's easier to stop, history than to stop communism, that type of thing, But the budget called for several measures which were regarded as oppressive. There was a capital gains tax, there was a property tax, gift tax, and compulsory savings. Can you imagine the plight of a public servant who's working for about $72,000 a month? That is what it was then in 1961. That was the salary of a public servant. And he was told to submit his pay for a deduction. So even from the little he was receiving, it would be compulsory savings. So this was the method that the PPP hoped to introduce in Guyana in 1961. And to some people, it seemed that the PPP was taxing, urban public servants and other government employees in order to finance rural development to the benefit of private farmers. Well, in the Guyanese political landscape, that is a very difficult formula for people to accept. In any event, it is clear that the public servants, not only did they not get wage increases, but they were being told that they had to submit to compulsory savings. So many people weren't happy. The business people weren't happy. Public servants weren't happy. And as a result of that, there was some response, some reaction by the British Guiana Trade Union Congress. The BG Trade Union Congress had as its president a person who was closely aligned to the United Force. He was not aligned to the PNC. He was aligned to the United Force. The TUC was not controlled by the PNC. And you must understand that when the strike was called, there were many unions, and many unions wanted to have better deal for their workers, for their members. So in February 1962, the BGTUC, not a political party, but the TUC, called a general strike to protest against the high taxation and the low salaries, particularly of public sector workers. So there's a huge demonstration against the PPP. And on February the 16th, in 1962, there was a disturbance, and the PPP government the governor then declared a state of emergency and requested the deployment of British troops. And the British troops came in. They were always lurking. There was always some warship, because at that time, Jamaica was the center of the British Army in the Caribbean. And once they knew that there was some disorder, they started sailing, and the British Army was deployed. Part of the business district in Georgetown was burnt, and there was a lot of looting. But it was not an ethnic conflict. It was something that arose out of the BGTUC's general strike. And the strike was about taxation. The strike was about salary increases. And the British Army quelled the disorder. Several people were shot by the army, and sections of Georgetown were burnt and looted. After that, the next year, the BGTUC called another strike. This time, the strike was meant to protest against the introduction of another labor relations bill. As I pointed out earlier, the labor relations bill in 1953 triggered the suspension of the Constitution. 10 years later, the PPP introduced almost an identical labor relations bill. I must explain that the GIW or the GAW, which was supported by the PPP, was not recognized by the British Guiana Sugar Producers Association. At that time, there was a union called the MPCA, the Manpower Citizen Association. And the president of the Manpower Citizen Association was also the president of the BGTUC. So you can see there was a lot of in the pestle other than the mortar. There's a lot in the mortar other than the pestle, sorry. What seems to be happening then is that the BGTUC, under that particular president, was trying to protect his own union, the MPCA, against the GAW, the Guyana Agriculture Workers Union. So the scene was, there was a vicarious struggle between the MPCA and the GAW, and also between the PPP administration and the BGTUC. The PPP, of course, wanted to use its majority in the Legislative Council under a very unbalanced system, not only to control governmental policy, which every government does, but also to control the trade union movement by strengthening the pro-PPP Guyana Agriculture Workers Union, just as is happening today. That strike in 1963 lasted about 80 days. It was the longest then in the English-speaking Caribbean. And finally, the PPP had to withdraw the bill before the strike could come to an end. So by 1963, this was the situation in Guyana. And the leaders of the main political parties went up to London for a constitutional conference. And at that conference, it was clear that on the one hand, the PNC and United Force did not want to continue with the first past the post system, but the PPP wanted to retain the first past the post system. The PNC and the UF wanted a PR system, a proportional representation system, which is what we have now in Guyana. And so that was the situation that existed in October 1963. Because the PPP felt under the PR system, it would lose its commanding majority in the Legislative Assembly. The parties could not agree on correcting what was seen as the unbalanced electoral system, this first past the post system. And they could not agree on the timing for independence. So these three parties, mainly the PPP, PNC, and UF, agreed that the United Kingdom government should resolve the controversy, which it did. The United Kingdom government then imposed the PR electoral system. It retained the voting age at 21 years and directed that new elections were to be held before independence. This created a firestorm. The PPP, although it had agreed to have the United Kingdom government resolve the controversy, refused to accept the resolution. And the General Secretary of the party, when he came back to Guyana in January 1964, which is where we are now, exactly 60 years ago, called for a hurricane of protests. The PPP mobilized its supporters to have what they call a freedom march. One group started at Charity in what is now Region 2. Another group started at Crabwood Creek in what is now Region 6. And they converged in Region 4 in Georgetown on the place now occupied by the GDF Camp Payangana. At that time, in 1964, it was a rifle range, which was used by the British Guyana Volunteer Force. But that is where the rally was held, the PPP Freedom March, and that is where the hurricane of protest was launched. So we had a situation in Guyana at that time that the PPP set out to obstruct general elections. This had nothing to do with labor. It set out to obstruct the general election, to prevent the general election under the PR system from being held in December 1964. It wanted to remain in office up to 1965. Don't forget, it was elected for 4 years in 1961. So it refused to accept that its term of office could be cut short. And it felt it could outlast the opposition. It felt that the cooperation between the PNC and United Force would dissolve by the time some other elections were held in 1965. But it then decided deliberately to embark on a campaign of violence in order to make the colony, as we were then, ungovernable. So even before any form of strike was declared, arsonists started to destroy hundreds of hectares of sugarcane. Agents of the Guyana Agricultural Workers Union started to intimidate workers who supported the Manpower Citizens Association, the MPCA, which was recognized by the British Guiana Sugar Producers Association. So that is where we were. So violence came to Guyana. I call it the mother of all violence because that is how the disturbances started. Much of the violence you see today is a reflection of what the PPP started 60 years ago in 1964. And locally, it was cold-blooded and methodical. It wasn't random violence. It was systematic. It was driven by persons who were trained terrorists. These were persons from the PYO, the Progressive Youth Organization, the youth arm of the PPP, who were trained in Cuba and who received money, or the PPP received money from the USSR, what was then the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which, of course, we know today mainly as Russia. There were other republics, but Russia is the main remnant of the USSR. But those persons were trained, and the PPP was financed by Russia to make this great revolution. And many of the defectors, the many members of the PYO who did not agree with what was going on in the country, admitted that their training was aimed at fomenting violent revolution in British Guiana at the time. So at the local level, this was how this violence started. At the international level, globally, the PPP painted a picture to the world that the hurricane of protest was really an anti-colonial revolution against the British. And they were fighting for freedom. They tried to align themselves with the revolutionary movements in Cuba, in Colombia, in Guatemala, in Nicaragua, and Venezuela. But this had the effect not of impressing the world, but of convincing the world that the PPP was becoming involved in Cold War politics on the side of the USSR and against the USA. On another occasion, we could examine this Cold War between the states which were aligned to the USSR and those which were aligned to the USA, what people call the East-West conflict. Ideologically, therefore, my friends, from 1954 to 1964, you can see that the PPP systematically, methodically was prepared to involve itself in certain actions. It was prepared to sacrifice human safety, the safety of Guyanese citizens. It was prepared to sacrifice public security in order to seize total control of the entire country by any means necessary. And that, my friends, is the origin of civil violence in Guyana, 1964. And we see today the consequences of that campaign of violence, which we now know in Guyanese history as the disturbances. Thank you. God bless you. And be safe.
Each man must